Um, Hope everybody had a good Easter. I want to talk to you about a few things before we get into our lesson today. Um, One thing, remember your papers that are due on Friday. That's the papers about who is the best Civil War commander, in your opinion. Please remember to back that up with facts. They could be a commander or leader of some sort. They don't have to be a general. They don't even necessarily have to be a military leader. I have already had a pretty interesting paper turned in with regards to that. But that'll be due, I think I said Friday of this week. You can turn it in to me really by Sunday of this coming week. So please keep that in mind. The test that I have graded overall, pretty good. So that's good. However, I am still missing a number from this group. Please keep that in mind. We will be trying to contact those people over the next day or so to make sure we get those tests in. So you will have a Zoom review on Thursday at 10 o'clock. Your test will be on Friday. Test will be available on Friday. You'll actually have till Sunday to get that back into me. So please keep those things in mind as we move ahead. There'll be two sections that I do a YouTube lesson on for this lesson over the next couple of days. All right, in your notes, which will start, they still will say election of 1860, early Civil War. You want to scroll down to naval actions. And naval actions, that will be the section where we start. Okay, and it'll go to the end of what I uploaded in Gray Book Wizard for you. All right. Early in the war, Union ships blockaded southern ports. We already talked about that being a strategy against the South. The South was very heavily reliant upon exports. So you get your ports blocked, that's a big deal. The South, of course, remember the North had a navy, an established navy. The South did not. So the South used small, fast ships that slipped through these blockades. They were called blockade runners, to get supplies in. Really over time, though, the blockade was very effective, and it got to the point that the trade through the southern ports dropped by more than 90%. When you're dependent upon exports or imports to get your supplies, you're battling a war, and you can't get that's going to be a problem for you over time. The South then in turn started to use ironclads. The Union had abandoned a warship at the beginning of the war named the Merrimack, and the Confederates took the ship and covered it in 4-inch iron plates. You can find pictures, drawings of this. The Union countered with their own ironclads, and one of them was called the Monitor. And the Monitor and Merrimack were the two famous ones out of Civil War. And they battled. The battle name is in your notes, the Battle of Hampton Roads. And the Merrimack and Monitor battled to a draw. You'll need to know that. And really to the end of the war, the Union blockade held throughout the war to the end. So despite what the South's efforts were, on this, it wasn't effective. And of course they became more desperate. And we talked a little bit, we mentioned, and I think I asked y'all right before we left on this break, about how many of you had actually seen the Hunley down in Charleston. So them using the submarine, we'll talk about that a little bit later in these lessons. But it was an effective strategy by the Union. Some of the battles that we have listed here. During the Battle of Seven Pines in June of 1862, General Joseph Johnston is wounded. He was the commander of the army there, the Confederate Army in Virginia, and he was wounded, and Robert E. Lee was appointed to replace him as what became of the Army of Northern Virginia. And that the significance of that was Lee replacing Johnson, and of course Lee. It was basically an upgrade as a commander of Lee taking over the Army of Northern Virginia. And the rest, as they say, is history. Of course, he goes on to become the things he did, become famous. The 7 Days Battle, not to be confused with the Battle of Seven Pines, in June and July to July 1st of 1862. Union forces under General George McClellan were threatening Richmond. Lee successfully defends the capital and launches a series of bold counterattacks against the numerically superior Union army, forcing them to retreat. That's a recurring theme that the South was fighting. Generally, they were fighting men down. They were rarely in a situation where they were battling someone and they were up the numbers. It wasn't unusual for them to be, fighting down 2-1 or sometimes more in these battles and coming out victorious. But so anyway, McClellan, the Union general, he had the pedigree. He's been widely criticized, basically for being not being aggressive enough, always kind of waiting for everything to be perfect. It's certainly, the conditions are never going to be 100% perfect in battle, but not being aggressive enough ultimately gets him removed. Battle of Antietam, September 8, 1862. Robert E. Lee tries to invade. He invades Maryland, hoping a Southern victory on Northern Soul would be a great blow against Northern morale. The Union actually learns of the battle plans, so they're aware, and they attack the Confederates at Antietam. And more than 23,000 Union and Confederate soldiers were killed or wounded. Very bloody battle. And Lee had to withdraw back into Virginia, but McClellan fails to pursue him. Once again, he does not follow up a situation where he can pursue him, really, put heat on him and possibly even destroy Lee's army. President Lincoln replaces McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside as commander of the Army of the Potomac. So McClellan's out, Burnside's in. It won't be the last change of commander of the Army of the Potomac. Fredericksburg's listed there. December of 1862. Union forces were headed toward Richmond again and met Lee's army outside the town of Fredericksburg. Lee withdrew his army to a hilltop looking around the town. Very formidable position, defensive position. 6 times Burnside ordered his troops basically to attack, and 6 times they were repulsed, and the Union casualties were very high, and it would be one of their worst defeats during this. And maybe Burnside continued on because just McClellan had caught flack for being not aggressive enough, but just continuing to attack a superior position, and lost a lot of men, so that was a very bad defeat. Following up on that, some months later, May of 1863, Chancellorsville, despite being heavily outnumbered 2-1, once again that was normal, Lee and Jackson defeated the Union Army at Chancellorsville, and Lee split his forces in 2, and Jackson outflanked the Union Army, and that's how they came up and won. Very famous the way they did that in terms of getting the victory. The victory winds up becoming really an awful one for the Confederacy from their side, because General Stonewall Jackson's killed during this. And he gets killed by friendly fire. Winds up, a Confederate sentry thought an approaching soldier was a Yankee, and he opened fire on him, and it turned out to be Stonewall Jackson. Jackson had his arm amputated from the wound, but winds up, pneumonia set in, and then several days later he winds up dying. He dies on a Sunday, as was his wish. I put his last words in there, which was recorded words, which were, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." And Lee, of course, was devastated at the news. One of his best fighting general was now dead. He mentioned when he heard of Stonewall Jackson having the amputation of his left arm, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he famously said something to the effect of, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." And such was the importance that he put in Jackson. The war in the West. Union goal in the West was to seize control of the Mississippi River. And General Ulysses S. Grant began moving toward that goal. And in 1862, he attacked the captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. And he pushed to south to Shiloh, which was a village on the Tennessee River. And the Confederates, won the first day. But Grant Grant wound up turning back the Confederates at Shiloh and winning that battle, and that was a bloody battle as well. More Americans were killed or wounded at Shiloh than in the American Revolution, War of 1812, and Mexican-American War combined. Union lost 13,000, and the Confederates around 11,000, including General Sidney Johnson. The April of 1862, Union ships captured New Orleans and Memphis, and the Union now controlled both ends of the Mississippi. During the Battle of Mobile Bay, Union Admiral David Farragut captured New Orleans and closed the Mississippi to shipping during this. He's credited with saying, the admiral that's credited for saying, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." I have the quote in your notes. But once they get to that point, they're controlling the Mississippi top to bottom, and that's a pretty big deal in terms of travel, supplies, moving troops, weapons, and such. The last Confederate stronghold in the West was Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Ulysses S. Grant in May of 1863 began a siege of the city, cutting off supplies and food, and the Confederates held out till July the 4th when they surrendered, and now Union forces controlled and split really the Confederacy at that point. And shortly after Vicksburg, Lincoln would make Grant commander of all Union troops, and Grant was sent east to fight Lee. Grant was at least providing victories, where in the east it was frustration and probably very much viewed as underachievement from the Union Army. So Grant's on his way east to fight Lee, and the rest of our lesson we'll get into the Emancipation Proclamation and then some of the battles later in the war once Grant gets east, some of the important things that go on there, and we'll talk more about that in the next section. So talk to you then.